All right, thanks to all of you for joining us today for the second of 8 symposiums that are hosted by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. We're going to wait a couple more minutes until we get others signed in here, and then we'll get going.
Good morning, Dennis. Thanks for joining us. Do you mind turning off your camera and muting your mic until you're good to go? Thank you.
All right, let's see here. I see folks starting to trickle in, but in the interest of starting on time, and this is a recorded webinar series for those of you that, so for those that are joining us a little bit late, they can go back and watch the entire webinar later if they so choose to. But thank you for joining us today for the second of 8 Energy Symposium webinars hosted by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. The purpose of these events is to present topic-specific information to the Alaska Energy Security Task Force as they work on developing a statewide energy plan. This is the second one, and so if you missed last week's webinar, which was on natural gas supply and options for Cook Inlet, you can find the link to the recording on AEA's website, and we can drop that also in the chat here for those of you that might be interested in that. Today's presentation is on Alaska rural energy, so challenges and opportunities for reducing the cost of energy for our rural communities. And by rural communities in this context, we're mostly talking about those that qualify for the power cost equalization program. We're joined today for this conversation by Bill Stam, the president and CEO of the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, Connie Fredenberg, Ingemar Mathiasen, the energy manager of the Northwest Arctic Bureau, and Dennis Miners, the president and founder of Intelligent Energy Systems. And between Bill and Connie, I'm going to present a few slides on some of the research that I've been involved in here at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, looking at performance and outcomes for rural utilities in the state. So we're going to give about a half an hour or so for each presentation, including Q&A. As these presentations are really intended primarily to inform the task force, only task force members are going to be able to unmute to verbally ask questions, but all webinar attendees will be able to submit questions to the Q&A box on your webinar screen. But again, please note that we're going to be prioritizing questions asked from the task force members. And today's meeting, as I noted before, is being recorded, and the presentation slide decks should be available also on the Alaska Energy Authority website. And with that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce Bill Stam, the president and CEO of AVAC, to kick us off. Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gwen, and thanks to the task force for having this discussion about rural energy. I have a presentation to put up. I'm going to try to share my screen on that. And just as a clarification, Gwen, are we doing questions right after, or are we saving them all to the end?
I think what we'll do is we will, thanks for asking that. I do believe that all three of you will be able to stay on to the end of the webinar, which, ends at 1 o'clock. And so I'd say let's start with some questions directed specifically to you, Bill, and to each of the speakers as they give a presentation. But there may also be an opportunity for a little bit of a discussion between all of the speakers at the end if you're able to stay on for it. So let's just go with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. So can everybody see my screen? Maybe a thumbs up or something? Is that
Yes, we can see it.
up? Okay, great.
Yeah.
My name is Bill Stam. I'm the president and CEO of Alaska Village Electric Cooperative. What I'd like to do today is run through just an overview of what AVEC is and how we provide power to the communities that we serve, talk about some of the pain points in providing power in rural Alaska, giving a kind of a broad background of some of the issues, and hopefully provide some input for folks that maybe don't get off the road system all that often. My screen is not advancing. Give me just a second here. Here we go. So Alaska Village Electric Cooperative is a not-for-profit electric cooperative. We serve 58 communities. Everybody that has a meter on the AVEC system is a member of AVEC. We've got 8,300 members, 11,500 meters. The way we do that, these are all isolated grids. We've got 48 power plants, over 160 diesel generators. So there's usually multiple diesel generators in each plant, typically sized for different loads for different times of the day, different times of the year. As a result of our generation being primarily diesel, we burn over 9 million gallons of diesel a year. Last year, that cost the cooperative $35.3 million. And I've got that in a little different color to come back to it later. 515 miles of distribution lines does not sound like a lot to most rural cooperatives, but ours is spread out over a very wide swath of Alaska in very small pockets. So we've got almost 5,000 poles to maintain, over 1,000 transformers. We are, since 2005, we've been installing wind systems when we can. We kind of have been on the forefront of wind diesel systems, as well as some other electric utilities in Alaska. A lot of folks from around the world look at what we're doing on our microgrids with integrating renewables. But we've got 12 wind sites with 32 wind turbines serving 20 different communities. Some of our communities are close enough that we've been able to tie them together with, we call them tie lines. They're not really transmission. They are distribution lines that are anywhere from 4 to 20 miles in distance, connecting smaller communities. Annual revenue last year was a little over $60 million. And as you can see, the cost of diesel fuel takes up a large chunk of that. So the remainder is what we have to work with to pay for all of our non-fuel costs. Total electricity sold last year was 124 megawatt hours. The map to the right shows Alaska, and communities that we serve are called out with little black points and names. We do serve the community of Yakutat in Southeast, and we've drawn a line 1,000 miles out to Gamble. Farthest north is Kivalina, farthest south is Old Harbor, and the only one that's accessible by road is in Minto, which is off of the Hall Road north of Fairbanks. To accomplish these tasks, we have about 75 full-time employees. We also have about another 120 part-time operators. So the way AVEC operates, we have these diesel power plants in each community, and we have 2 or 3 power plant operators that work on rotating shifts. They're not full-time. They typically show up at the plant 3 times a day. They check that the day tank is filled with fuel, check the gauges, make sure the engines are running properly. Sometimes they have to manually shift from one engine to another, depending on the complexity of the switchgear, so that they're running the right engine to meet the right load. And that's it. But they have to do that 365 days a year. So there are typically rotating shifts. For any incidents that require maintenance, depending on the level of education and training that the plant operator has, they can do quite a bit of stuff in the plant. But if there's a major malfunction, typically all the distribution work is on overhead poles. So we have trained linemen that go out and do that work. Plant operators can change water pumps and fuel pumps, but when it comes to a major overhaul, we typically send in diesel mechanics to do that kind of work. We do have construction personnel, welders, those sorts of things that are all traveling techs that go out to do the work that we need to get done. As I mentioned, 58 communities, they have a variety of sizes. You can see that the gorilla in the room in 2014, AVEC acquired the utility in Bethel. So that's the one over on the far right, over 2,800 meters in Bethel. Smallest community is actually connected to Bethel. It's Oscarville with 27 meters. But the vast majority of communities are between 100 and 200 meters. And I've got a slide a little bit later that talks about average load and community size. One of the difficulties with rural power is obviously scalability. There's not a whole lot of load out there. This is the big box store in Shaktoolik. You can probably get everything from a loaf of bread to an outboard motor at that store. There are not a whole lot of resources. Everything that we do, everything that we build, we typically have to fly in or barge in. There's not a variety of hardware stores to go out and buy more parts and pieces. There's no electric supply or electronic supply stores that you can purchase things from. So everything you do, you better make sure that you've made a list and checked it twice before you go out there to build something. This is a typical layout of a rural community. This is an overhead shot of Tuksuk Bay. Tuksuk is both kind of typical and atypical. And it's typical because I'm going to use my cursor. I hope you can see that and try to point out a few things. Lots of residential homes. There's a school back here, which is probably the largest load in Tuksuk Bay. There's a barge landing. There's actually a barge at the barge landing. So most of the materials come in and get delivered to the community by barge. There is an airport. This is the old airstrip. When I was there back in the early 90s, that was the main airstrip, but a new one has been built. You can kind of just barely see the road that goes out to the new airstrip over here. Those are all very typical items that you would see in any rural community. This is the newer power plant. The older power plant is this smaller building here. Tank farms, we did a consolidation project in the early 2000s. So we built a new power plant. We're able to build tank farm, both for the power plant and also for the community facilities. The corporation is the fuel seller out there. The city has tanks, the school district has tanks, and they're all consolidated in one location. So those are all very common themes that you would see in most communities. Not all communities still have barge service. We do have to fly in fuel to a couple of communities. That obviously raises the cost of fuel. But some of the things that are different here in Tuksuk Bay, not only do we have wind turbines, there are actually 4 there now. We added another after this picture was taken. But there's also tie lines. So this community is the base power plant for 2 others. Tanunuk is over the hill to the left here on the coast, and then Nightmute. You can see the kind of the tie line leaving this faint line going off into the tundra, and then it wraps around underneath the side of the bottom of the hill and goes over to Nightmute. So both of those communities have a small standby generation module in case the tie line goes down. We can supply backup power to those communities, but 90% of the time the power is coming from this main power plant here in Tuksuk Bay. That provides benefit in being able to consolidate loads. Efficiency in diesel generation goes up in the size of the diesel generator. The very small engines have difficulty meeting the same efficiency standards. And if you have to run a larger engine for very small loads, you also have very poor efficiency. Talked a little bit about fuel and fuel deliveries. I know the task force is probably very familiar and has talked quite a bit about the gas issues for the rail belt and energy supply in general for Alaska. but diesel fuel is the lifeblood of rural Alaska. Not only does it provide for electricity, but also for home heating oil and transportation as well. Gasoline is delivered under a similar method. Typically, what AVEC does is it contracts with suppliers. They buy their fuel either from the lower 48 or from Asia and other points. They barge it up on large tankers. Those tankers sit offshore, and then they use smaller barges to lighter from the tanker back and forth to all the communities. As the ice melts in the springtime, the barges move north. As the ice comes back down, the barges move south. And it is a monstrous task just to get to all the communities in the short ice-free months that folks can operate out there. There are fewer and fewer suppliers of fuel. Just the cost of operating, the headaches involved. You've probably seen recent articles in the paper about the Alaska Marine Highway having very difficult time manning their boats. The same goes for all maritime industry. There is a crisis of personnel and availability, and costs go up every time there's difficulty getting manpower. Typical layout of an AVEC power plant. This one was built 2013-14 in the community of Stebbins. A couple of things I just want to point out. This is a consolidated power plant. We've had a variety of different standard configurations for our power plants. This one has 2 generation bays separated by some firewalls for fire protection in case one side was damaged. Hopefully we would still be able to maintain power. There's a central control building or a control room in that building. We do have heat recovery that goes over to the water plant from this power plant. The tank farm is a larger tank farm because Stebbins also provides power to St. Mike. We built a tie line. I think that's a 12-mile tie line or something over to St. Michael. The tank farm, not only did we have to bring in fill for the entire plant site due to threat of flood due to storm surge, but the soil condition is such that we had to drive piles in order to support the tank farm. So this is an elevated tank farm, very costly to go in and drive piles, import gravel, all those sorts of things for construction. And then distribution takes off from here and goes out to the community. I mentioned that we do have wind systems. Still, all of the renewables that we have on our system only provide about 5% of our total generation at this point. Even with the largest wind fleet, that's per wind turbine, certainly not by size. Our total renewable generation last year was 4.7 megawatt hours. And we have a variety of success in the communities, and it really depends on the ability to keep the turbines running, also the ability to maintain communications between the turbines and our power plants. There's a whole lot of coordination that has to go on in order to make those systems work properly. Weather is always a factor, and the ability to match the size of the turbine to the loads that are there. We're hoping it can be somewhat ameliorated with the battery systems that are now becoming at least somewhat affordable to put out in our communities. We were hopeful to have a battery mated with our wind system in St. Mary's. I'll talk about that project a little bit right towards the end. Last year, the pandemic and other supply chain issues has postponed that again to this year, and we are in a testing phase up in Fairbanks right now with the vendor that shipped it over from Germany where it was constructed. And we're hopeful to get it on the last barge this year, but there have been some issues that might push us into the following year. So barging items always creates an additional logistical hurdle, and very easy for a 30-day slip in any project schedule to push you into a following year, which wreaks havoc with manpower and a whole lot of things. So power consumption over the years, this goes back all the way to 1970, and you can see pretty consistent growth. Like I said, we took on the Bethel utility, which was a big jump in 2014. there's two numbers shown on this graph for every year that's shown. The white bar is what we've sold and the blue bar is what we've generated. The difference between those two numbers is both our consumption at our power plants and line loss through the communities. AVEC strives to make the line loss number fairly low. We buy very efficient transformers. That's an often place where you see some line loss in the distribution. And we maximize the use of each one of those transformers. Typically in a residential neighborhood in Anchorage, you might see a 25 kVA transformer serving 1, 2, or 3 homes. In a AVEC village, if we put up a 25 kVA transformer, it's typically serving 20 to 25 homes. And that's just, it's a combination of things. There's some diversity in the rural communities and very low peak values in each one of the residential homes, and they just use less energy overall in general. Not a whole lot of hot tubs or basement electric saunas in the communities that we serve. The total population of AVEC is about 31,000 people that we serve. That's similar in size to the communities of Juneau or Fairbanks, and we probably overall we use less than half the amount of power that you would see in any of those communities. Part of that is because of residential use is less, but also because there is very minimal commercial and industrial loads out in those communities. So what does that look like for the cost of power last year in 2022? Excuse me. This is a breakdown of our average cost of power. So we have a wide scale of what each community is paying. Places where we fly in fuel, the cost of fuel is quite a bit higher. So I think last year we actually broke the $1 barrier for some of the AVEC communities. That's a rarity for us. In Bethel, where the economies of scale are quite a bit better, it's probably in the 30 cent per kilowatt hour range prior to PCE. But if you throw all of our costs and all of our sales into one bucket, our average cost per kilowatt hour last year was about 52 cents a kilowatt hour. As you can see, more than half of that cost is just to buy the fuel to get it into our tanks. So where does the money come from? On the left, you can see the source of revenue by consumer class. So we just kind of break it out. So you can see the general makeup of who's buying power out in the communities. Quite a bit of residential. There is a large, 36%, I guess that got cut off a little bit, commercial use. That section of the pie grew when we took on Bethel. Bethel does have, obviously as a hub community, has a little bit more commercial industrial loads. Other public facilities would be water and sewer buildings, community facilities, the city hall or the tribal office, those sorts of things, streetlights, less than 1% of the total load, and then schools. Typically in any one of our communities, the school is probably the largest load. In our manual operated plants, plant operators have to get up and go down to the power plant and start the larger engine before they start making breakfast at school. So they can be the lion in the room in any of our rural communities. On the right-hand side, show who's paying for that and power cost equalization. We can do a whole seminar on that. Critical to the continuation for being able to pay for power in rural communities. It applies to residential and community facilities only. So overall, power cost equalization, AVEC, out of that $60 million last year, I think we got $11 or $12 million from power cost equalization program last year. We send out bills to our consumers that already deducts that the amount that they would be awarded by the power cost equalization, and then we wait for reimbursement from the state, which comes through AEA. But overall, 80% of that $60 million came from the people that are purchasing power on our system out in rural community. So give you some bullet points, things to take home. Why are things so expensive in rural Alaska? Certainly Size of the communities plays a big part of it. Small populations, small loads in general. No commercial or industrial loads to speak of. I believe there were, last time I checked, there were, I think, 4 fish plants in the 58 communities that AVEC serves. I think only one of them is still operational due to the loss of available commercial fishing out in communities that we serve. Expensive power means less development. It's hard for, especially without any sort of power cost equalization benefit, a small mom and pop shop to open up a snow machine or an outboard repair shop would be very expensive because their electric loads they'd have to pay full price. There is no benefit to them. Utilities are very capital intensive, require lots of physical plant. Talked about all those power plants and diesel generators, wind turbines, distribution systems, and in those isolated systems, reliability counts on redundancy. So we have to repeat a lot of the stuff that we do and provide the ability to make up for what happens if some of our equipment goes down. Difficulty to access things. Even if you send something out on a barge, there's no guarantee it'll be able to be brought to the community. We moved a generation module that was retired out of Mountain Village to Hooper Bay at the beginning of this year. AML got it to the beach. They were able to unload to the beach, but there was no way to get it off of the sand to the road system in Hooper Bay to get it up to the plant. So they ended up having to reload it and bring it back to Bethel. We're still scratching our head how to figure out how to get that across the soft sand up to the plant. But all of those things are a consideration in everything we do. The diesel delivery cost and storage often exceeds the actual unit price of the fuel. So we typically buy on spot market trading costs, and then there's a markup by the delivery company to get that fuel to our tanks. Obviously, there's all sorts of regulation and compliance issues. We have to maintain records of all the transformers we keep, all the fuel we handle. There are lots and lots of fuel transfers that happen all summer long in order to get fuel into our tanks, and it can be a logistical nightmare. Operation and maintenance is more expensive. Everything we do, the freight, the travel, the lodging, there's typically not a Motel 6 or a restaurant for contractors to use when they're out there. You have to find someplace for lodging, often sleeping in school rooms, empty clinics, city offices, those sorts of things. AVEC does maintain some limited living quarters in each of our communities. They typically don't have plumbing. We haul our own water. We have electric toilets. It's not a glamorous lifestyle for our traveling personnel. And getting qualified personnel that want to endure those conditions for multiple years gets to be difficult. And as the complexity of our systems gets more, the availability of people that will operate and maintain those systems becomes less and less. Some of the things we do to maintain or improve on that, we always take every opportunity to improve on our generation efficiency. I see I'm coming up on my half hour, so I'll buzz through this. Minimize distribution losses, try to tie communities together while we can. We welcome new facilities or new communities if they're cost effective. There have been very difficult hardship cases where we look at it and there's no way for AVEC to join or have communities join the AVEC family without putting an undue burden on the communities that have been part of AVEC forever. There have been folks or communities that have joined or that receive grant funding to upgrade facilities, and then AVEC's more than willing to take on the responsibility of continued maintenance. But many times the facilities as they stand would require way too much work and way too much capital investment from AVEC when we still have a lot of capital investment to make in the communities that have been part of the family for a long time. We do anything we can to maximize the use of the diesel fuel. So we capture and sell recovered heat. We do have some facilities for excess wind energy that we are sending out to water and sewer facilities, and continue to promote energy education, workforce development, and economic opportunity in all of our communities. Just want to highlight a project that is still yet coming to fruition. I hope I could have told you that the energy storage system was on its way, but I mentioned earlier that's still in Fairbanks and testing. The community of St. Mary's used to supply power as far as Pickus Point and the St. Mary's Airport. A few years ago, we were successful in building a tie line over to Mountain Village. It's about a 20-mile tie line. And we installed a 900 kW wind turbine. In the last year, we were able to displace 35%, I think, of the diesel fuel for all of those communities with wind. It is a large 900 kW turbine that is serving an average load of about 600 kW. So there, with the energy storage, we're hopeful that we're going to be able to one, cross the 50% threshold, and also expand the beneficial electrification that might be able to be used for excess wind. That's it. That's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions now or later.
Thanks a lot, Bill. And I encourage participants to use the Q&A function, which is the tab on the bottom, to go ahead and submit any questions that you might have. And what I might do, because we don't have any questions yet, Bill, but I'm hoping we get some, I might just show my few slides quickly, and then encourage folks to think about any Q&A that you might have. Otherwise, we'll bring Connie on and we can save some of those to the end as well. So I want to make sure we give everybody enough time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here quickly. Uh-oh, I can find it. Here we go. So one of the things that I've been doing as part of my research at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power is really kind of taking a look at how rural communities and how rural utilities are performing, and how we can provide them with the kind of support that they need to kind of increase the value, increase and reduce the cost for rural residents. And so one of the things that we've done, and this has been totally independent from Bill, so he's had no input, AVEC hasn't really had input into this, although I am interested in seeing if the analysis does make sense to them, is really taking a look at how AVEC is performing compared to independent utilities within a small region, in this case, the Bethel census area, that has about roughly half AVEC communities and about half independent communities, and kind of taking a look at the performance of the utilities in those communities, looking at the economic factors. And the reason why I was interested in this is that there's an existing paper, and I can drop that in the chat here in a moment, that we worked on at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power with some other partners a few years ago, looking at pathways to renewable energy development. And what we did is we kind of took a look at a number of communities, 24 communities that had been identified by the Alaska Energy Authority as having a viable or economically developable renewable energy resource. And then what we did is we wound back the clock to 2007, before the Renewable Energy Fund was established, which really kicked off a lot of development in many of these rural communities. And we said, which communities were actually successful in terms of actually developing renewable energy systems, and what were sort of the attributes or the sort of the conditions that existed in those communities back in 2007 that might have allowed us to predict which communities would be successful. And so we actually looked at 37 different variables. I'm actually gonna go through just super quickly and show those. I know this is kind of hard to read, but they basically went across a number of these economic, technical, social, political, environmental, and infrastructure sorts of areas. And then it was everything from how big is the utility, what kind of utility ownership is there, what's the cost of power, looking at the regional government. So like we're going to hear from Ingomar, are they in a borough? What are poverty levels? You know, what is mean household income? You know, all those kinds of questions. And surprisingly, there was really only 3 predictive variables that indicated whether or not a community would develop a renewable energy project. And basically those those represented two pathways. The first was having community capacity. And when I say community capacity, that's specifically around the management of a utility, right? And so in this case, we actually used the DEC RUBA scores as the primary factor for sort of being able to identify community capacity in terms of managing a utility. And then secondly, no additional subsidy. What that means is that in addition to the power cost equalization program, that community didn't have any additional subsidy available to it. And that might be kind of that might not sound, that might be kind of a weird thing to say, but actually there are communities, and these are primarily in the North Slope borough, that do receive an additional subsidy on top of the power cost equalization program for power. And so one pathway was communities that had high capacity, inherent local capacity, and no additional subsidy. So an example of that would be Unalakleet. And then the second one is that a community was pooling resources across multiple communities. And so AVEC would be a really good example of that, or other, or like Inside Passage Electric Cooperative. I think I saw Jody Mitchell on this webinar, where you're pooling resources across multiple communities. And that can also include things like the Chininik Wind Group that I think we're going to hear about from Dennis Miners in a little bit. So that was another sort of pathway that communities had to successfully developing and managing and maintaining a renewable energy project. So with that being said, I was actually really interested in AVEC because that's one of the main ways in which we're sort of pooling resources across multiple communities and seeing across a number of different variables how it compares to independence in the same region, understanding that that we're sort of taking account of different variation in size and distance from the coast that would also impact, like, example, fuel costs or the delivery of fuel costs. And so these were the variables that we found to be statistically significant. This work hasn't been published yet, but I'm hoping that it will be very soon. So these are things that that were variables that we saw that had a statistical significance in terms of a difference between the AVEC communities and the independent communities. And I thought this would be interesting for the task force members to see. So here is just a quick chart showing 6 of these. So line loss is the way it's described in the power cost equalization report. It really means kilowatt hours that are produced but not sold. And so line loss could be one example of that. It could also represent, for example, unmetered loads. So if there's loads that are not being taken account of in the system, that could be that could represent line loss. And so, so there's a significant difference there. Looking at fuel costs for AVEC communities, that's able to really do more purchasing in bulk and things like that. There's a difference there. And then looking at non-fuel costs, fuel efficiency of their generation. And then ultimately looking at both the subsidized rate, which is the rate after PCE for residential consumers, and then the unsubsidized rate. There's a significant difference, and this is just within that region. I also just kind of wanted to share this because this was actually a little bit of a surprise to me. When you look at the power cost equalization program can also be applied to specific facilities within, and I think that actually, it looked like when I looked at Bill's, it looked like about 7% of the load was sort of for these like sorts of community buildings. So this would be like the washateria, the tribal hall, streetlights, the sewer or water plant, basically community facilities. The community has to apply to make those a qualifying facility, and then they can apply a certain amount of PCE to that. And so that's actually, there's a maximum allowable threshold that's based on like 70 kilowatt hours per month per resident in that community. And so when you look at AVEC communities, their average across all of their communities just within the Bethel region is that they're utilizing about 80% of the potential PCE credits that they're eligible for those kilowatt hour sales, whereas independent communities are closer to about 20%. And so this is actually a huge difference. And when you look at this, the difference when you add that up across all of those communities. And of course, I just need to put in 50,000 caveats here because there's differences between communities, and there's a lot of other factors at play here. But if you said that those independent communities could theoretically get up to that 80% level, the difference would actually be just within this one small region, the Bethel census area, would represent about $1 million in total. And then going back to this here, the difference between the subsidized and unsubsidized rates. So understanding that not all kilowatt hour sales qualify for the PCE program. So that unsubsidized rate difference can make a really big difference for these communities. Looking at the kilowatt hour sales across all of these communities, the AVAC communities are paying about in total about $100,000. And again, this is really rough numbers, and I don't want to like indicate that there's that, but there generally is a trend where there's quite a bit of higher efficiencies with AVAC communities, despite the fact, and again, correcting for size and distance from the coast and those sorts of things. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. If people are interested in that, because I don't want to spend a lot of time into this, I want to pass this off to Connie and address any questions that we have. But there's a couple of publications that are out there right now. The second one in particular is where some of the data comes from that I just shared, this critical pathways. We can drop that in the chat. They're both available for free online as publications. And then there's these 3 publications that I'm working on right now that should be published within the next month or so. One is just a case history of AVAC. The second one is this sort of quantitative analysis of AVAC's performance that I've sort of been presenting on, a little bit of an advanced snapshot. And then this third one is really sort of this Goldilocks zone of like size of utilities for remote communities. So that kind of that balancing local control, which a lot of folks really want to maintain, and that's understandable, with economies of scale across numerous different communities. And so I've been working on sort of this paper, trying to find where that optimal zone is for communities in terms of pooling resources versus like maintaining local control. And so those might be of interest. If anyone is particularly interested in any of these, please just contact me directly, and I'd be happy to share an advanced copy if you'd be willing to help kind of peer review it. So, and with that, I'll stop sharing. And it looks like we don't have any questions. So either it's a late Thursday, Bill, you were super complete, or people are falling asleep in front of their computer, which I don't know that I believe. So I think right now we'll just turn it over to Connie. Sorry, Connie, I didn't mean to eat too much into your time here, and feel free to take a few extra minutes. But I'd love to turn it over to you and go ahead and share any slides that you have.
All right, Brittany's going to pull mine up for me. And I apologize for no pictures. Usually I'm big on pictures, but I didn't have time to do that this time. I've been working with the smallest of the small utilities for several years, since 2008. And I would say that there are several reasons why cities and tribes choose to retain ownership and operation of their community utility. One is they want to control how they make power and how they run their utility. They want to maintain that local control. And the utility creates local jobs, including the board members, council members that serve on the utility board. They get paid stipends for attending meetings. And the council wants to be able to control customer rates and payment plans if necessary. And in some places, the utility is a source of revenue. If it's run well, they'll use that money to cover the cost of, say, a community pool, or keeping a gym open for for folks to access. And other times it's because AVEC said no, and for valid reasons, I understand. But so then these small utilities from small villages are facing many challenges. Like the first and foremost is finding and keeping staff. As Bill mentioned, it's sometimes hard to find folks, and it's hard to keep them. And you know, at a minimum, the utility has to have a clerk, power plant operators, and meter readers on site. Then having a mechanic, electrician, lineman, bookkeeper, accountant, those things may have to come from outside the community. And a lot of them are installing these renewable energy, which makes things even more complex so that sometimes they can't fix them on their own. So they have to hire outside consultants. And there are some villages that are so small, I question if having a centralized utility is actually the best thing for them. And I don't mean to pick on anybody, but Lime Village has a population, an official population of 6. And my daughter does the PCE reporting for them. She says they have 15 residential accounts, but many of them are just for the summer. So they're not year round. And their rates are $1.77 a kilowatt hour. I don't know how anybody can afford to pay that. And I've thought about what's the best solution for them. I don't know if self-generation, maybe have a utility that consists of somebody who can fix home generators and sells fuel and maybe provide some PCE for that. But I just think having a central utility for such small communities is starting to not make sense. Collections is an issue for these small utilities because it's hard to collect from your family and friends. And I know there have been utility clerks that have quit their job because they can't bear the, having to say, no, you can't charge power. And then board members have to navigate complicated issues. Board training could maybe help with that. I've talked with one utility. He wanted to put together a PowerPoint for his board of directors so that they would understand what allowable expenses were and how PCE works with renewable energy. And we were going to make a PowerPoint in English and Yupik for his board members. And then we were going to share it with other communities in the area. But he quit to be an airplane mechanic. So I lost him. Some of the solutions to these problems, one that I've really pushed is pay folks. If you've got a good person at your power plant, pay them well and evaluate them annually and give them pay raises so they stick around, because having to retrain new staff over and over is real hard on a utility and adds unnecessary costs. We've even tried bringing in student interns. If you're 14 and older, you can work in the office. If you're 16 and older, you could work in the power plant, along with a adult operator, and workman's comp will cover those folks. Developing partnerships with nearby communities is a good idea. Some folks who don't want to give up local control are looking to their tribal consortium, the borough, or maybe even a subsidiary of an ANCSA Corp, to help form a loose co-op so that they don't have to give up local control, but they have access to, like with AVEC, with the circuit riders that come around and help maintain the plant doing things that the local operators can't. And if you have to, hire high-end consultants and technicians to do things you either can't do in your community or don't want to do. I have to say, I work for some utilities that they're perfectly capable of doing their annual report, but they don't want to. They would rather hire me to do it, so they don't have to. And prepaid metering, the collections, fixing that with prepaid metering was a brilliant solution. It really worked. Those AMPI systems I've installed with Clarissa Quinlan, we installed them in 43 villages, and they really work. But they don't make that system any longer. She preferred the card-tied system because she feared that the internet in villages is unreliable, to say the least. I know it's getting better, and so maybe some of these smart meter prepay solutions could work in the future, but she's dedicated to this card-tied system, and there's very limited stock remaining. She bought up all the meters that were left at the AMPI factory in the United Kingdom, but she's limiting them to existing installations to keep them operating. Next slide, please. But I have to point out that some of these standalone rural electric utilities do an exceptional job under extremely tough circumstances, and mostly due to the good fortune of having a devoted and dedicated staff and good partners. And it doesn't really matter how many people are left in your community, it matters who's left. And some of these creative solutions, I want to start with Nikolsky. When I first went to Nikolsky, there were 28 people there. They're now 41. Many of the elders have passed away from when I was there, but it's a young population, and they're making babies and adopting babies. They're almost up to enough kids to have a school again. But they had a power plant operator years ago that just wasn't doing them any favors. And when he left, the young folks decided to take over. And I was working with TDX Power at the time, and we trained 3 pairs of operators. Each pair was a man and a woman. The men liked to get in there and do the dirty work. They would change the oil, change the filters, clean the generation room, but they didn't like to write in the log. So the woman would go along. She did all the documentation in the power plant log and wrote down any repairs or maintenance work that the men did. And that worked so well for them that those 3 couples trained 2 more pairs. So their power plant has run quite well in the years since they've started doing this. But they don't want to do the administrative work. So they pay a woman in Anchorage to do all the administrative work. The Chininik Wind Group, which you'll hear more about from IES, they did a great job of partnering with each other. They're nearby communities. They help each other install wind turbines because they have prepay metering in many of those communities, and these electric thermal stoves, it required 2 meters. So they had to install dual meter bases on a lot of places, and they go around and help each other do that. And they help each other make repairs that one alone wouldn't be able to do. So that's worked out really well for them. And Northwest Arctic Borough, Ingemar is going to tell you more about this, but one of the issues with PCE is that you can't depreciate grant-funded equipment, and that goes for diesel generators as well. And I've always considered that depreciation amount to be the placeholder for a savings account to repair, replace equipment. Well, if it's grant funded, you had to add on to your rates, which wouldn't be covered by PCE, in order to save money for that, which most small utilities did not do. Creating independent power producers within the community who sell power back to the utility is great. It's a great workaround. Now that is a fuel cost. So every time they file a fuel report, that the cost of those kilowatt hours get added in to the cost of fuel. So it doesn't make for really lowering the rates any, but it keeps that money within the community. Instead of giving it to Crowley or another vendor, that money goes to the IPP, and then they can use that money to repair, replace, or increase the renewable generation. Next slide. And I just had to throw this in there because, like I said, the depreciation is one issue with PCE, but another one is it just directly butts heads with renewable energy. And my example is Puvarana Power Company in Kong. According to Rod Phillip, their manager, they have reduced the amount of imported diesel fuel for that community for both heat and power by 50%. That's huge. And when doing their annual report, I help them. They do it mostly themselves, but I help them, and I review things for them. But I asked the RCA when they reviewed the report to count those excess wind kilowatt hours when they calculate line loss. but not to count them when they calculate the PCE rate, because that causes the expenses to be divided by a larger number, which doesn't seem quite fair. It reduces the PCE rate unfairly because they're selling that heat kilowatt hours for 10 cents. And that's just not much. Their regular rate is 65 cents. So I think it unfairly reduced their PCE rate. And on top of that, they take the revenue from the sale of those heat kilowatt hours and subtract it from expenses, further reducing the PCE rate. And they only lost 3 cents, a little more than 3 cents in 2021, which is not that big of a deal. It's $22.50 on 750 kilowatt hours. But as they add more wind, which they plan to do, and more electric thermal stoves and possibly even EV charging, it's going to make a bigger difference. And the RCA dealt with a hydro utility a few years ago. They decided that they had a unique situation in that all they had to do was open a valve to create those excess kilowatt hours that they sold for heat. And they did subtract the revenue from their non-fuel expenses, but they did exactly what I wanted them to do for Kong. They counted the kilowatt hours when calculating their line loss, but removed them when calculating the PCE rate, which added up to 9 cents for that utility, which is a big deal because they did a lot of excess kilowatt hours. And in my mind, my argument, and I plan to push this, Kong would have had to curtail their wind in order not to make those excess kilowatt hours. So I don't really see the difference between the hydro example and the wind example. But we've got to convince the RCA of that. And I truly believe that reducing diesel should be incentivized, not penalized. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Thank you, Connie. I really appreciate that. And, I appreciate that point that you made about Kongiganac, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more from Dennis on that as well. But, that $22.50 that you mentioned, that's like that's on a monthly bill for somebody using 750 kilowatt hours, which is kind of the maximum threshold allowable for PCE right now. But if you look at that, over a year, I calculate it's like $270 a household at that threshold again. And for the community overall, I'm just doing very back of the envelope numbers, that'd be more like $40,000. So that really starts to add up and be pretty significant when you start to think about it that way. And I don't think that the PCE program was really designed when we were thinking about like wind to heat or some of these other really innovative approaches. And so that idea of like rethinking how it's applied, because we do want to incentivize the reduction of diesel fuel consumption for both electric power, but also for heat, is something that maybe the rural subcommittee could really be looking at as part of this task force. Does that sound fair to you?
Yes. Hey, and I also wanted to point out one other thing. We were talking about community facilities. There's also a backlog of approving community facilities at AEA. And I've worked with several utilities that put in applications for community facilities in years ago that have yet to be approved. And I guess AVEC's better at writing them. I'm not sure how they get all of theirs approved when we've had some serious issues with that.
Well, and to be clear, and Bill can maybe clarify on this, I don't think AVEC is actually submitting the application. I think they're just kind of supporting the communities and doing that.
Right, which is how it works. The actual community facility itself has to submit the application, which I've helped them do multiple times. Mm-hmm.
So I think that Tony has a question here. Tony, if you're interested, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask the question directly, or we can go ahead and take a shot at it.
Yeah, Gwen, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I had to wait a second to be unmuted. Hi, Connie. You mentioned a couple of times things that were counterintuitive, and I think the phrase you used was that in one case was the RCA that PCE butts heads with renewables, and you had a couple of examples where there were RCA decisions that seemed a little bit counterintuitive. And my question is, I wonder if that's state statute limitations, or are there statutory changes that need to be made, or are they just decisions that are 100% discretionary by the regulatory commission? Thanks.
I wish I knew the answer to that. I intend to find out, because the hydro utility, which I don't want to name names or anything, but they challenged it, and I read the order from the RCA, and it just said that they had a unique situation. So it was a decision on the part of the RCA. It wasn't in statute that they just chose to deal with it in that manner. And I don't understand the difference between that and the wind, to tell you the honest truth. And I hope it doesn't require a change in statute, because that's the most frightening thing of all, is to bring this up before the legislature and let them start dealing with this giant PCE fund, endowment fund that they might find another use for. So if we can keep it out of that realm, it would be best.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I take your caution seriously from my own experience with different things, but energy related things. But the task force does have there is a subcommittee that's going to be looking at legislative or regulatory or other systemic issues that maybe don't make sense, and that we could recommend a change. I'll just leave it there. I guess it would be, as a task force member, I guess I'd like to know if it's a statutory issue. But again, I take very seriously your caution around raising that issue. But things that are counterintuitive and are just plain old common sense, it sure would be not. I'd feel much better as a task force member if I thought that we could make some effective change in in those kinds of examples. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate your comments. And these webinars are really intended to be sort of informative and provide, some background for the task force members to deliberate, more fully on, for example, potential proposed changes to statutes and things like that. If there is interest in having the Alaska Center for Energy and Power or the Alaska Energy Authority compile more information about some of these, ideas that are out there for consideration of the task force, we can certainly help support that kind of thing. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the floor first, I think, to Ingemar. And I do want to just kind of, first of all, thank Connie, because she is honestly, in my mind, one of the heroines or heroes of rural energy issues in this state. She's really been so wonderful at helping many of these communities. Same thing with Ingemar. He really falls in that same category. And I do want to say, even though I did want to throw out those numbers related to the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, I do really appreciate the opportunity that these small communities have to be innovative and do things. Connie sort of mentioned the idea of the prepaid meters and things like that. And there are some really innovative solutions that are being driven by a lot of these independent communities. We'll hear more from Dennis. Ingemar's been working pretty closely with AVEC too, kind of trying to find some opportunities there to collaborate in innovative ways. And I just, from my personal perspective, having worked in this area for at least 20 years now, I just think that these independents are driving a lot of the innovation that is happening in rural Alaska. So sort of finding that balance between economies of scale and cost reduction, and the ability to kind of create a dynamic environment where there's the opportunity to really try new things. I think that's a really interesting balance to find. And Ingomar certainly fits in that category of somebody that's been working really hard to come up with innovative solutions, not just on the electric power side, but also looking at thermal questions, heating, and also innovative approaches in terms of even ownership structure of projects. And so with that, Ingomar, I really appreciate your time today. I know all of you that are on this webinar are super busy doing things, and it's the middle of the summer and there's a lot of projects happening. So thank you for the time. And Ingomar, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Do you have some slides, or are you just speaking today?
I have the slides.
Okay, perfect.
Good morning, and thank you, Gwen, and the Energy Task Force here. I have a couple of things I would like to present on today. One is the regional cooperation we're doing, and I will turn on my share screen here right away, so we can get to. I think this should be it. Can you see my slide there?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So, over the last 50 years, we started in 2008 with basically an issue of existential survival. I will just go ahead here with slides. There's quite a few, so if we can go through them. No, it doesn't want to move. Just a second here. See if I can get this to work. Get out of that one. Why is it not appearing? Okay, we'll see here if it works. I'll turn on sharing again. It's this one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we can see your entire desktop now, Ingomar, which looks about like mine. So
Sorry. Let me see if I can get the right screen.
I can also share if you need, Ingomar.
Yeah, let me see if I can find the right one here. And there we go. This one should be. But I can't move it.
you're having a hard time advancing them.
Yeah.
Is that your PDF version, Ingomar, or is that a PowerPoint?
No, it's the PowerPoint. I don't know why it doesn't work. Okay, I'll do stop share. Can you turn on yours there, Brittany? From the beginning, I guess.
Yeah, sorry, I only have fit page. There we go.
Can you go back one? Okay. Okay, well, we can be in the second one. Just go to the second one. And of course, it's an existential threat for many reasons. So we'll go to the next one. So in 2008, as Energy Summit, we started our process of trying to figure out what to do with energy. Everything spiked, of course, like, you know, at $140, and fuel in the region started to go up. We thought that we were going to run out of oil, and we started our energy steering committee at that time. If you look at this graph, of course, you can see that the outside fuel has come down since then, and should have done the same thing technically for our fuel. Go to the next slide. But it didn't. we are now climbing faster than ever, especially in the last few years, and we are actually increasing this by about a quarter more per gallon as the fuel barge is landing as we speak. You can go to the next one. The fuel prices now are climbing up into this existential status at $15 or more per gallon, and Ambler is currently actually at 18. And these are the prices before they're going to increase as the barge is landing right now. What's interesting on this one is the differences between the actual retail prices in the communities and what it's landed for by AVAC or our school system. You can see the new fiscal 2024 prices in red. That is the approximate prices that it's going to land at for wholesale. But the small communities, they don't buy in the scale of AVAC or the school system, so their price is ending up a lot higher. I just wanted to emphasize that we're basically talking about electricity here today, but there is this other big piece of heating fuel and gasoline that is actually affecting everybody even more. Next one. The electric rates, of course, climbs accordingly. And as you can see, no attack at the $1.13 right now, likely to increase, I'm sure, too. And we have Kobuk Shungnak Ambler right up there, right around $1 at current. I'm also including here the utility non-firm power purchase rates for a discussion further down this in the slide stack here for how we operate as an IPP up in the region. Next one. So we started our energy plan in 2008. You can go to the next one. And it's been running now for 15 years. And we meet 2 times a year to make sure that we are on track with our energy plan with all the 11 communities. Next one. In 2014 to 18, something more added into the picture, as you know, and that's the climate change mitigation plan, as we are now starting to erode and have other problems, including the carbon problem. Next one. So we changed our statement just slightly that we weren't just doing renewable resources because of replacing the diesel fuel, but also to combat the climate change and the CO2 increases in methane and so on and so forth. The 10% decrease of imported fuels by 2020 actually has been changed a little bit to 2025. 25% is what we're aiming for 2030, and maybe 50 by 2050. Next one. And to do that, of course, we need to try to get diesel off when it comes to electricity. This is a snapshot from Shungnak diesel off last year when we started to turn it on. Next one. So our single focus back in 2008 to 2012 was to try to stabilize the cost of electricity, developing the local resources as much as possible, wind, hydro, and possibly bring down the cost per kilowatt hour. And the projects were funded and implemented by the electric utilities to offset the use of the diesel fuel. However, the cost to the households per kilowatt hour did not change much in the communities that receive PCE funding. The funding balances out against the rail belt, and basically all of Alaska ends up in the same configuration, right around 20-24 cents per kilowatt hour, balancing against each other. As you may know, of course, been in the discussion, the natural gas in the Cook Inlet is changing the picture, and if the cost goes up for the rural community, for the rail belt utilities, and if that starts climbing to 30 cents per something per kilowatt hour, and the rural communities will get less PCE and will climb up to the same status at 30 cents or higher. We're all balancing on that PCE formula back and forth. So what happened, of course, as we built more and more alternate energy projects, like Connie mentioned, the PCEs then decreased to the communities. Next one. In 2007 to 2012, different wind projects were put in place. I don't have Kotzebue included here. This is from the borough perspective. And of course, Kotzebue was much earlier with wind projects. They started back in 87, 89, oh, no, sorry, 90, 97, 98, 99. And these are the AVAC project in Selwick, and then Buckland and Deering that was put in place between 2008 and 2012 from renewable energy formula from Grant 1. A small imprint at the bottom of that grant said, as a condition of the grant, independent power producers will agree to sell energy resources for electricity and heat at cost-based rate for the economic life of the project. We actually didn't see this. This was small print, and we just recently found it. And if we had thought the way we do now back then, we probably would have made these wind turbines into IPPs in 2012. Next one. The wind project has done well. The Kotzebue projects are included here, and 3.4 million gallons of this is not needed over the years that it's been implemented, has been a success, of course. Kotzebue Electric up there was one of the forerunners in the state. Next one. And the first independent power producer showed up in 2012. Very familiar, I'm sure, with Fire Island. Just making a point here that 2012, the first independent power producer actually showed up in the state. Next one. In 2012 was also the year when we implemented the first solar arrays up in our region. And in 2011, we had a test panel that showed that we had 11% capacity to do it. In 2012, we got a hold of a CIAP grant, Coastal Impact Assistance Program. And with that, we convinced DC that Alaska was indeed not dark. When they asked us what we were going to do, how we were going to do solar to clean up the environment, we said, well, we're going to decrease the amount of fuel for our fuel plants and lower the cost of operations. And that would create less spills, cleaner environment, and better conditions. And they go, well, it's dark in Alaska, isn't it? And I said, nope, it's not. And they eventually reluctantly allowed us to put all the solar arrays up. And since then, we have saved 50,000 gallons over 10 years. Next one. We have 10 years of continued solar development because of that, and 250,000 gallons now saved, 7.8 million pounds of CO2 not released. Next one. So approximate minimum values per year behind the meter solar projects at the water plants. So these are not visible to AVAC or to any of the utilities. They are behind the meters, and the value of them is balancing exactly of what the PCE subsidized or endowed rate has produced. And those are the numbers right there. Basically 30,000 plus savings per year for the water plants of the region. Next one. So here comes the interesting one. So if you look at the top one there, if the Shungnak utility project at 233 kilowatts was actually put on the households, the value would have been $51,100 per year. As an IPP, its value is 112,000. So it was actually better to implement in this utility, in this community, the solar array. This is a value for the households, right? As the households actually own the IPP in Shungnak, they make the 112,000. If they had put the solar arrays on their houses and then behind the meter, the value would have been only 51,000. Because of the difference between the avoided diesel rate and the actual PCE rate that is the result of it. If you look at Norvik, it's actually the other way around. In Norvik, the avoided rate is 16 to 17 cents, and the PCE rate is higher, so it's more valuable on the households in Norvik than it is as a utility IPP array. I'm just making a point here that this has to do with how the PCE is calculated, right? It offsets the same amount of diesel fuel, whether the solar array is behind the meter on the households or with the utility, doesn't matter. It's the same amount of diesel fuel that is offset, but the actual value to the community is different. If you look at Kotzebue's 966 kilowatt array now, which with a production of 920 megawatt hours per year, behind the meter value at 220,000, and its value as an IPP would have been 165.6. What's actually happening, since it's a utility array, not an IPP, is that 165,600 is the actual decreased PCE that the utility KA does not receive this year because of the array. This is the inequality between how the renewable energies functions against the diesel fuel.
Ingmar, can I just ask just a clarifying question just on this point right here? Initially, a lot of the projects in rural Alaska were funded through the state, through the Renewable Energy Grant Fund. And so even though this issue has been recognized for a long time, the thinking was the state's making the investment, the state's recouping some benefit. But now more and more of these projects are not being funded through state grants. Would that be a fair statement to make? So the state is, or the PCE program is incurring this benefit based on projects that are no longer necessarily being built with majority state resources. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say what happens is the more people turn to outside sources and DOE and others to implement all these projects, the more the PCE funds is not being used because it's not returned back to the communities. The PCE should apply to the renewable energy also, not just to the diesel fuel, because that money could be used to maintain the array and taking care of it, and that implies also the wind turbines themselves. That has been done earlier. There is no reason why the communities should be penalized and lose the PCE just because they want renewable energy instead of diesel. So that's where the inequality, and you can see the discrepancies here back and forth depending on the avoided diesel rate, which is the balancing point in the PCE formula. So, yeah.
And the total amount of PCE that's been actually allocated to rural communities has been going down, both as a combination of that and, as you noted earlier, the fact that there's less discrepancy between rail belt rates and some of these rural rates, that gap is closing too.
Yeah, and I will add to that the PCE fund is an endowment and not a subsidy. It was put in place for rural communities in lieu of the rail belt grids and the Bradley Lake systems. So I mean, it belongs to the rural communities, and it should be in some fashion get back to either the utility or to IPPs. And I'll show you here in my IPP example here coming up.
Thanks, Ingmar.
Next one. So in 2017, we did a 23 kilowatt array in Norvik, and Buckland and Deering got their first solar arrays. Next one. And in 2020, Kotzebue built their first solar array together with the Shungnak one that was completed in 2021. And Kotzebue has now advanced theirs to from 630 to 966 kilowatt, just doubled it this year. And the difference here is interesting. You'll see in a minute here that on the one hand, of course, Kotzebue wants to go to diesel off. Shungnak has operated as diesel off together with the partner AVAC. And produced 818 hours of diesel off operation last year. There is things that we were still working out with the project, and it's not easy to just integrate it. All the utilities needs to be upgraded to microgrid status, and in many cases that takes quite a bit of money, up towards $1 million need to be advanced to utilities that wants to do renewables effectively. And that money has to come from somewhere. And it's hard to justify that in the grant requests we do to the Department of Energy or USDA or the state. Next one. So in 2020, then we went to the transition of independent power producers. And this is just a picture of Norvik and Buckland arrays and the wind turbine in Deering. The next one. So why do we develop them? The communities can take control of their own energy future, developing the local resources. This creates buy-in and good relationship with utility, and they can sustain the PCE support to the community and stabilize the energy cost. Better economics, circular economy, funding collected pays for further development and local workforce expertise. The money stays in the community instead of sending the money to far-off countries for oil. So since we started this, I mean, the difference in the community having either utility far away in the case of AVAC with some of our communities, and if building from far away creates not a real good buy-in to this particular thing where they actually making their own energy, selling it to AVAC selling it back to them, makes a much better relationship between the community and the utility. Next one. So reason for regional approach to this. Well, regional support to apply and manage the big energy grants, including access to the Department of Energy and other funding. Economy of scale, we can increase the efficiency of making the project happen, because making a small project in a single village is more expensive. And we can then go for the regional energy infrastructure, like interties, in particular bulk fuel developments, which we are looking at right now, hydro projects and interties, and direct households involvements, which also is happening here, as you. Next one. The borough in this case is helping with administration for the independent power producers for PCE calculations, utility based and billing, job creation, workforce development and training, capacity building. So, I mean, this is some of what boroughs should do anyway. So it fell right in our, in our code to do some of it. And the region then speaks with one voice, can advocate on behalf of the PCE and the statewide energy policy that creates energy security. And it's needed to stop the increase in cost of energy and hedge against the fuel increases and supply disruption. So next one. The Shungnak Solar IPP project. Okay, so Shungnak is 223 kilowatt. It uses 550 panels. Blue Planet is what we decided to go with for environmentally friendly lithium phosphate batteries capable of holding both the communities of Shungnak and Kobuk. They are tied together with an intertie. So they can actually run on just the battery for 2 hours during the summer without generator or solar power. So we started in April 21, and completed the construction by September 21 at a cost of 2.36 million, funded by USDA and our local VIF and rural funds at another million. Next one. Here's the IPP example. So the grant opportunity was from USDA and secured by the two tribes, allowing the borough to apply on behalf of the two communities. We created something called a TIDO. And the communities are then interconnected, of course, working together. And through an MOA, a working agreement was then executed between the two tribes to become the new IPP of the Upper Kobuk. The power purchase agreement was executed with AVAC, and AVAC then pays for the incoming power and recovers this cost partly then from the PCE fund. Another MOA is executed with the borough for help with administration and investment of funds, and an energy fund is established for the communities, and funds are dispersed for insurance, maintenance, and further build out of the solar array. Next one. And of course, we got 2 awards. We have got the Project Award of the Year in 21 and the Most Equitable Community Solar Array in the United States in 2022. A lot of fun. Okay, next one. Here's the actual financials of the project. Estimated gross income for the IPP, 120,000. And they ended up about 90,000 in the fund at the end of that year. And it'll be similar to this year, likely. And then what we do is create half of that goes into an energy fund that's invested into the stock market so they can actually grow. And the other half is the operational fund. Next one. We're now doing NOATAC. Actually, tomorrow we're going up to do ribbon cutting on the NOATAC project. It's a little bit bigger, almost $3 million by DOE, the NAVA Commission, Red Dog Tech, and MANA have put in money into this one. It's all fly-in community and our most expensive community. We're also making this one expandable from 275 to 375 within a year. So we have the ribbon cutting ceremony tomorrow with a hot dog party out there, if everything looks good. Next one. Selawik will follow. We now have that fully funded at 3.6, and it's going to be very similar, a little bit bigger. And we actually got an additional funding from Renewable Energy Fund 15. So it's going to be close to 700 kilowatt hours, fully developed with a megawatt of battery. Next one. So here's the build out. This is approximately what we need to get to the full build out of what we think we can put in every village without going overboard in the financial realms for maximum diesel offset per year. So we can get up for this is the rural communities, I mean, only the hub around Kotzebue. Kotzebue is not included here. So we can get to a point of 260,000 gallons offset per year and keep the PCE funds. The next one. And here's our operational structure that's just taking place. There is a new version in the Celewick grant. We have a kind of a sidekick called REPOP, which is an emergency network system that we're putting in place in the borough so that all the IPPs can have a go-to place for emergencies so that everybody works together. And we're also doing this together with AVAC, so we will have technical assistance at the call of the button if something goes wrong and try to get personnel out as soon as possible. We realize that as the complexity of these systems increases, we need to have faster and faster response, and to get internet fully developed in all the communities is pretty much a must to operate this microgrid system. Next one. And then I want to add on a little thing. That's the IPPs. And I just want to also add in that the solar PV has the same footprint as heat pumps. And you can bring the next one is the same months of the year for Alaska that we have the sun, and we can also do heat pumps. And this particular picture shows that if your COP on a heat pump, I'm not sure, I mean, all of you probably know what a heat pump is at this point, mostly mini splits we're talking about here that can either heat or cool the house. There will be some pictures here in a bit. I wanted to just emphasize that this is the next step. After we electrify, we need to get after the heating fuel, right? And this is one way to do it with the heat pumps. Next one. This is what Maine did. This was 2017, they started this. They run heat pumps over in Maine down to -27 Fahrenheit. And we have seen some of the heat pumps in our region work well down to -40 and still function depending on the size of it and survival. COP goes down to just 1, so it's the same as an electric heater, but they can save quite a bit. You'll see here in a minute. Next one. The advantages is low cost heat, low cost air conditioning, comfort, safety, air quality, and no CO2 emissions, providing that you're operating off electricity from the renewable energy system, of course. If you are operating off the generators, then it would actually increase the amount of CO2 emissions, since you need more power to actually feed to these pumps, since this is a new system that the communities didn't have before. Another way of heating or cooling the house. Next one. We did 13 air-to-air heat pump installations in 2017 to 2018, and they are all functional at this point and doing well. They're Panasonics. They were oversized for low temperature environment and has saved their communities a significant amount. You'll see in a bit here. Next one. I want to make sure we stick on time here real quick. One innovative approach was, one guy called me up after he got it installed, and this was in August, September. It was hot out, and he just got his meat. And he realized that, well, if he put it in front of the heat pump, he could actually suck the heat out of the meat, put it in the house. So he ended up with a cooling tent right outside his house and saved the heat from that meat, saved the meat, and heated his house all at the same time. This picture went all around the world with Panasonic. Next one. So here's the COP curve. You can see what months it actually is really functional, and it's the same curve as you have when the sun is up, obviously. You can see the green offsets. The next one. And we've created an Alaska online calculator for this. A lot of collaboration went into it. It's working great. You can see at the bottom the low temperature Mitsubishi high heat single zone 38,000 BTU unit in Ambler would save 463 gallons of #1 oil. Annual savings for that household is $2,500 a year. That's at $12 fuel. We are now at $15 fuel in Ambler. So savings over 14 years, about $35,000. If somebody in Ambler has this unit, is likely to save 40,000 or more over their lifespan. The heat pumps works. It's a matter of harvesting the energy when you have it. In Alaska, we harvest when we have our resources, whether it's meat, fish, or whatever, and we'll harvest during the sunny season and in the summer for 6 months. There's significant savings if all households have heat pumps of various kinds. Next one. So this is the pilot project for Ambler. We put in 68 of them out of 65 households out of 68, completed in 21. These are actually solar powered. We put a kilowatt of solar also on the households that was not tied to the grid, tied directly to the heat pumps. And these heat pumps can function straight on solar when the sun is out in the summer and not take anything from the grid, or a combination or grid only. They're not that big. The ones we put in is 12,000, but they do exist up to 38,000 BTU. They're not exactly done for pictures. The Mitsubishi's is the ones, and some other ones that have come out now that will be preferable. Next one. There's some pictures of the installations. You can go to the next one pretty quick. So here's I think my last slide coming up. Energy Steering Committee has been running 15 years. We're making a sustained effort and realize that change has come slowly with understanding of the new ways of operation. Continue to work with the regional energy plan. It's the vision for the future from the people, and make sure the document gets updated periodically as it's the dynamic living document, and adapt to change it, right? So the policy is, do we develop energy resources just for short-time profit and sell them, or do we develop local energy resources that can sustain for the foreseeable future and create that cleaner environment for our children? I think that's the last one. We can go to one more there. I can take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingmar. I really appreciate that. I kind of see a common theme that I think Dennis will probably continue around this idea of looking at all sort of energy needs in our rural community and not just addressing electric power separately from heating. And I think that that's something that I've seen rural Alaska really taking a lead on, really thinking about how we approach that. And I really appreciate your time again and a lot of the things that you've been working on this for quite a while, Ingmar. So thank you for sharing a lot of those approaches. I don't see any questions. There are plenty of participants, but I think this has been a really good conversation. I might just turn it over to Dennis first, and then we'll just kind of see if we have any questions at the end. So for those of you that are joining us here, please think about whether you do have any questions for any of the panelists after Dennis finishes. And Dennis, part of the reason I wanted to wrap up with you, and I hope you're still with us here, is that I know you're somebody that has been thinking really big and creatively about what the future of rural energy could look like from our communities. So I want to go ahead and wrap up with you. I guess, did Jen just ask a question? Am I getting a little note here? So just really quickly, Ingmar, before we switch over to Dennis, Jen was wondering if it's possible to share the dollar per kilowatt hour rate for the Shungnak and Noatak, the independent power producers, for the power purchase agreement that they have. Is that public?
It's actually probably a discussion between me and Bill, whether Bill would allow it.
Okay.
Have that document.
Yeah. If you got that number, Ingmar, I don't mind sharing it. It's based on a percentage of our actual fuel cost, and in Shungnak it's fly-in fuel typically. So we're paying upwards to $11, $12 a gallon just to get fuel in the community. So there is a very big incentive to displace diesel fuel in that community.
So Ingmar, if you do have that and are willing to share, otherwise maybe it's something that we could provide after the fact to the task force if there's interest in that. We don't want to put you guys on the spot.
It's the avoided rate in the presentation. That is what is the buying rate by AVAC, if the question, if that's the question. And it's adjusts every month according to the fuel cost that AVAC brings into the.
Okay, so it's adjusted monthly. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. With that being said, Dennis, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to bring us home. Do you have any slides, or are you just speaking today? Oh, we can't hear you. Looks like you're still on mute. There we go. Try now. Dennis, we can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Excellent. Thank you.
Great. So I'll just run into my slides. My name is thanks, Gwen, for having me. Hi, Bill. Hi, Connie. Hi, Ingemar. Hi, committee. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. My name is Dennis Miners. I've been working in rural energy since 1993 when I was hired as a special assistant to Wally Hickle to look at reorganizing rural energy programs. So if you look historically, there's probably some change in rural energy every 10 years. So we're back in, in the 80s, I think it was getting the PCE program scored. 70s, it was PCE program. 80s, it was getting the Energy Authority. 90s, it was reorganizing the Energy Authority. 2000, it was reorganizing it again. Starting the Renewable Energy Fund. 2010s, it was growing interest in renewable energy, and now we're in the 2020s, and I think that the real message is the transition is beginning to happen. When I was at the Energy Authority, I had 3 strategies for addressing rural energy, and I think everyone's kind of touched on them. Bill and Gwen talked about industry structure, the relationship between the different utilities, and the cost of rural energy. And the issue was that the cost of rural energy is really not the problem. The cost may be high, but the problem is you can't explain really why they're high. I mean, Gwen showed a couple slides about line loss or some other issue. You really can't understand why the costs are different between the utilities, and I think that's what's interesting, and why those differences have lasted for a long time. So the kind of 3 strategies are, okay, we gotta get a handle on cost by looking at how the industry is structured and the relationships among the utilities and their suppliers, and then getting some information about really how do they actually work, what's really going on. And then finally, and I think this is where we are now, innovation is probably going to drive the changes more than anything else in the future. So why don't you give me the next slide there? Am I doing, there you go. And here's the reason. The reason is there's been a lot of infrastructure investment in rural communities in order to maintain the quality of life. As that infrastructure investment goes up, the quality of life improves, and it gets more costly. And you have to find innovative ways to lower cost in order to maintain the quality of life. This is a picture right here of the school in Chafornac. I think the school in Chafornac was built, I'd say 8 years ago or so. This is a 45,000 square foot school. Before they had a 20,000 square foot school. And you can see how the population on the graph, the population sort of stays the same, but the fuel consumption continues to go up, both for heat and power. So how about the next slide? I've only got 10 quick. Here's my hypothesis, and I believe that there's data to support it. First of all, renewable-based microgrids are not only common, but they will be the primary generator of power in rural Alaska. 2, in the next 10 years, the deployments for renewables and renewable energy systems are going to accelerate. They're going to grow in size and scope and just quantities. And third is the progress that we are making in Alaska is valuable not only in Alaska, but it can support businesses and businesses that grow out of Alaska and interest in other countries. So we do have a bit of a lead. It'd be nice to be able to capture the value of the investments that are being made in these systems. How about the next slide? This was the hallucination in 2023. And I think you have to hallucinate a future. And this was based on surveys that we did in the community where we walked around and we asked people what they needed. And I was approached by some utility managers in the lower Kuskokwim region in 2000, in about 2000. And they said, well, we want to put up a wind turbine to decrease our dependency on diesel fuel. And I said, no, that doesn't work. You have to build a big enough system so that you can displace enough fuel to pay for itself and pay to the people to maintain it and operate it. So putting up one wind turbine in a community in a low penetration or low contribution application just didn't make sense. So I said, well, you got to bring together a group of other utility managers in your area, and we could talk about building projects in each community. So after surveying homes, we found out that the real problem wasn't that people had difficulty paying for their electricity because electricity was being subsidized by the power cost equalization program. And also, like Bill said before, people are not running hot tubs. They don't have pool pumps or electric saunas, or they didn't even have, or electric vehicles at the time. So they don't have big electric loads. The average electric load in most of the communities that I work in are 300 kilowatt hours per month or less. And in Anchorage, even in an energy efficient home, well, you guys probably know, it's probably between 600 and 700 kilowatt hours a month, maybe down to 5, but it's still rural people that live in rural communities, they don't use that much electricity. So the hallucination was, let's put in, they told me too. The manager said, we need redundancy out here. If we put wind turbines in, we just don't want one, we want more than one. So if it breaks, we can fix it and we can still rely on the system. So I was told, all right, let's see if we can put in as much wind as we possibly can, and then use that wind to displace heating fuel. So this was the idea in 2003. You put up a lot of wind, you integrate it with a powerhouse, you distribute it across the power line, and then you put it into the homes. And so I would say the 2003 hallucination is the 223 reality, with all the different changes that have been made. So let's take a look at the next slide. I think I only have 10 slides. Why wind? Well, because it's most everywhere and it's there when you need it. In the wintertime in particular, there's a good correlation between when the energy is needed and when the wind's available. And as wind turbine technology advances, those areas with lower wind speeds, where you can put in a wind turbine with a taller tower and an efficient rotor, it will produce an equivalent amount of energy, if not more, than solar at the same time. I mean, that's what we're seeing. So solar and wind are excellent complements. Solar can probably go everywhere. Wind can really provide the punch to provide enough energy to displace significant amounts of diesel fuel for heat, power, and transportation. Wind could probably be the major source of power for 80% of the communities in Western Alaska. Next slide. So we kind of measured what was going on. We did a first battery project with a small battery with some funding from the Emerging Energy Technology Fund in 2015. We put in the first lithium ion battery from LG Chem. It was a very small battery. The idea was we would put in a small battery that could be rapidly charged and recharged, and a lot of wind, and we would see if we can turn the diesel engines off. That first project was in Quinquillingock, and we ran 3,000 hours of diesel off operation the first year with 100. And so they had an average load of, I think, 180 kilowatts. We had 5 95 kilowatt Windmatic machines, which were originally built in 1984. We upgraded them. And 135 kilowatt hours of battery energy storage. And we were able to get over 3,000 hours of diesel off operation. So what this graph shows is that if we put in great big wind turbines and we put in electric thermal storage to store heat in the homes, that we could displace most of the diesel fuel in the whole community that was used for heat and power. But we needed to have big systems. We needed to have more wind, bigger wind turbines, more electric thermal storage, and a distribution grid that could handle it, and a battery bank. Next slide. This was our coherent technology in 2016. We had some electric thermal storage devices. On the right here, you'll see these little boxes. It's a cabinet that's full of ceramic bricks. And there's a special controller on those cabinets that allows the elements inside of the elements that heat the bricks inside to be sensitive to the grid frequency. We can manage the charge and discharge of each of those electric thermal storage devices across the grid in a way that it follows the wind load. So for instance, we might have 20 devices out there, and our multiple unit controller would say, oh, you've got 4 that are full, and you've got 4 that are half full, and you have the rest of them, they're all empty. Well, you can you can allocate and prioritize where this wind energy goes into those devices. And you can partition it based on how much wind you have. So for instance, we could get a variability in the output of wind of 30% in 2 seconds. So we could go from 300 kilowatts down to 250 momentarily. And we can allocate that amount of energy, however much energy we have, wind energy we have left, we can allocate that on almost a sub-second basis. So electric thermal storage proved to be very, very effective for moderating wind. The battery on the left, that was the first battery bank we had, and that's only got 135 kilowatt hours of energy storage in it. That stabilized the grid. We used a grid forming inverter. So we set that in the community. We sent an Ethernet cable over to the power plant, and we did modify the controls in the power plant, and we put some heat in the power plant. We were able to turn the diesel engines in the power plant off for long periods of time, run on wind only. So, next slide. What we're seeing is that with the savings from the fuel savings, it can be put into the local workforce. And I think that's really where I think that the renewables can provide the most value to rural Alaska. There are going to be a lot of jobs in rebuilding the grid, rebuilding and providing renewables. And I think that programs focused on really supporting workforce development in rural communities so that we're not bringing people in from Anchorage or Seattle or wherever, but building the workforce out there. There are plenty of meaningful jobs that can be created as we move toward renewable-based systems. Next slide. There's a couple things that we've had to struggle through, and I think that have held back the development of renewables is that we really haven't had appropriate technologies for rural applications, and we need to continue to innovate. This is a picture of the turbine that we have developed that can be installed on a tilt-up tower with a larger rotor. There was no, Bill can correct me if I'm wrong here, but we were told by the folks in the village who are very practical, the village managers, they said, we want a wind turbine that we can work on, that we can repair, that we don't have to depend on calling someone in a foreign country to operate. And so they specifically didn't want to go with the Northern Power wind turbine. They wanted something developed for use in their community. Over time, we've continued to invest in the development of a turbine specifically for rural communities, and I think we've gotten it. The cost is, we probably dropped the cost about 30% in terms of wind deployment, but we still need to get bigger, and the turbine systems need to become much better. There needs to be a market, and I think if the market was laid out, there'd be increased deployments, increased investment. The project would expand in scope, and they'd grow in scale. I guess the point I'm trying to make is this transition toward renewables has started. I think that the investment in fuel storage is probably going to be fixed, and the same with diesel gensets. There's not a lot of room to grow in terms of a diesel economy. So with respect to the task force, it would be helpful to really understand what the state of the art is for integrating renewables and what resources there are and kind of the costs. And right now, if we invest in reducing the financial risks and the technical and operational risks of these systems, we'll probably be driving a lot of investment into these systems. And finally, one of the most important things I think if we were able to do now is generate as soon as possible a history of investment performance. That way we can bring other resources in to address a rural energy problem and create some real businesses. So next slide. It could be my last slide. Yeah. So, there's my summary. I guess we shouldn't always assume that we have the right answers, because we probably don't, but we have some pretty good answers. There's some programs out there that there's some levers that the state could pull right now. I would say reviewing the requirements in the Renewable Energy Fund, reprioritizing, and removing some of the barriers in the fund, like the requirement for reimbursables, where a small community, if they get a grant, has to pay for it up front, and then they can go back to the Energy Authority for reimbursement. And also, things have changed. This whole shift toward renewables, if I look back at 2003, in 2003, when we had a hallucination about shifting toward renewables, we were told to go talk to a therapist because we were hallucinating. And what the issue now is, I think that our thinking, that the world has caught up. The opportunities have changed. There's a lot of investment coming in from the federal and state government, from the federal government. And we need to take advantage of that. And it's time to pull the goalie on this transition to renewables, not just for electricity, but for heat and for transportation and other uses that you can, other beneficial uses you can put it to. Maybe it's going to be purifying water, where you're going to be purifying water to make hydrogen. Now, if you're making a fuel, hydrogen is not efficient, But the transition will be, if there's another fuel in a community like hydrogen, it's going to, it could be on the pathway to 100% renewables. So you need some diesel. I think that's probably the most cost-effective way to make the transition. But there will be opportunities to create other fuels. And the systems are going to become increasingly more automated. And then it's going to be a matter of making sure that we have the operations and maintenance capability to maintain them. So that's my summary. Hope it fits with what you guys are thinking about.
Thanks, Dennis. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to ask you one quick question and then we'll have to wrap up here. I'm curious, you talk about the workforce and jobs, and like one of the observations just anecdotally that I've made in working in some of your communities or talking with folks is that we're not necessarily talking about like 1 or 2 full-time jobs. We're talking about a diverse number of like sort of part-time employment that seems to fit pretty well with what community members are looking for. Like, for example, the people that are maybe doing repairs on the wind turbines aren't necessarily the ones installing the electrothermal stoves and things like that. Is that an accurate statement? Can you make a comment on that?
Well, I think that if we start looking at the number of jobs that are available, a number of job opportunities, and we were to add them up, you look at the whole market, there are a lot of good jobs in replacing electrical distribution. There are a lot of good jobs for training electricians to put in electric thermal storage or install solar, upgrade electrical systems in homes. There need to be pathways for both full-time and apprenticeship jobs. You mean journeymen who could work outside the community as well as part-time jobs in the community or in the region.
Yep. Thanks, Dennis. I want to be cognizant of time and kind of wrap up for today, but I really appreciate your time and your thoughts and your comments. As a reminder to everybody, this webinar is going to be recorded and it will be available on AEA's website. Next week, same time, 11 a.m., July 27th, we're going to have a presentation on global energy trends and the grid of the future. That's going to be a combination with a couple folks from Sandia National Lab, and we're also going to have case studies from Southern Australia and Iceland, and some of the things that are happening in those markets that Alaska might benefit from learning about. So thank you, Dennis, Ingemar, Connie, and Bill. Really appreciate your time. And thanks to everybody else who joined us today. And we'll see you next week. Thanks.